Earlier that day, a retired judge living in the peaceful community of Merritt Island decided to step outside and do some yard work. His home was situated along the edge of the Indian River, providing a clear view of the water. As he was preparing to start mowing the lawn, something near the shoreline caught his attention. At first, it seemed like a large object, perhaps a piece of driftwood, or even an animal resting by the water's edge. Intrigued, he took a few steps closer. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he immediately contacted local authorities. Police positive identification of the founded woman as Misty Morse. Misty Morse was born on April 10, 1978, in Springfield, Ohio. As a young girl, she experienced her family relocating to a new city, Indian Harbor Beach, Florida, a place that would soon become home. However, shortly after the move, her parents' marriage began to unravel, and they decided to divorce. Misty stayed with her mother, but her bond with her father remained strong. Despite the challenging circumstances, Misty's resilience and optimism shone through. She was a cheerful, outgoing girl who had a wide circle of friends and developed a deep love for the outdoors. The beach became her second home, and she loved to swim in the ocean, surf the waves, and simply enjoy the sun and sand with her friends. After graduating from high school, Misty moved forward with the next chapter of her life. She worked various jobs, including in retail and at a local restaurant, before deciding to further her education. She enrolled in a nearby community college, although, at the time, she was unsure about which career path she wanted to take. She believed she would figure it out along the way, letting life's experiences guide her. By the summer of 2000, Misty, now 22 years old, was working as a waitress at a local cafe. She loved spending her free time with friends, enjoying the carefree nature of her youth. On the evening of July 20th, Misty left her home after telling her mother she was heading out for the evening. The two chatted briefly, and just before Misty left, her phone rang. She answered the call with only a few words and hung up shortly after. She then turned to her mother, mentioning she had to go. The conversation ended there, and Misty left for the night. The next day, when her mother returned home from work, Misty was not there. Initially, her mother wasn't overly concerned. Misty sometimes worked late shifts, and on those occasions, they rarely crossed paths. She was an adult now, and perhaps she had stayed over at a friend's house. But when another day passed with no word from Misty, her concern began to grow. By the third day, there had been no sign of Misty, and her mother's worry deepened. It was completely out of character for Misty not to reach out, and the situation was starting to feel wrong. The strangest part was that Misty had not come to pick up the car they shared. They usually swapped it every week, but this time, it seemed like Misty wasn't coming back at all. Her mother tried calling her repeatedly, but each attempt went unanswered. The calls, however, went straight to voicemail, and the silence was unbearable. On July 24th, 4 days after Misty's disappearance, her mother's panic turned to full-blown fear. She knew it was time to contact the police. But before she could make the call, there was an unexpected knock at the door. When she opened it, a police officer stood there, and the look on his face immediately told her something was horribly wrong. The officer informed her that Misty's body had been discovered just the day before, on July 23rd. The news hit her like a ton of bricks. Her worst fears had been confirmed. The discovery had come in an unexpected way. A retired judge in Merritt Island had been tending to his lawn when something unusual caught his eye. His property sat along the river, and as he glanced toward the water, he saw something in the river. Initially, he thought it was the body of a large animal, but as he approached, he realized it was something far more troubling. Alarmed, he immediately called the authorities, and when the police arrived, they made the grim discovery that would change everything. The circumstances surrounding the evidence found at the scene were peculiar. Several items were discovered near Misty's body, and these were promptly collected for forensic examination. There were materials found that are often used to secure items, adding complexity to the investigation. Upon the initial medical examination, pathologists were faced with a challenge. There were no obvious signs of injury, and the condition of the body, along with the items found, made it difficult to pinpoint the exact cause of death. The evidence simply didn't add up, and this lack of clarity only fueled the mystery. A lack of DNA or fingerprints left investigators with little to go on. There were no solid clues that could point directly to the suspect, so the authorities focused their efforts on identifying the victim. Misty's identity was eventually confirmed, and the investigation continued, albeit with few leads. Forensic specialists worked tirelessly, examining the ropes, plastic bags, and duct tape found at the scene. While they found nothing of particular use, one small detail stood out. A few short dark hairs adhered to the duct tape. The hairs did not match Misty's, and this discovery became one of the few significant pieces of evidence. The hairs were sent for analysis in hopes of uncovering some clue about the killer's identity. Once Misty's identity was confirmed, the investigators spoke with her mother, who described the events leading up to her daughter's disappearance. The last time her mother saw Misty was on the evening of July 20th. She recalled that Misty had received a brief phone call before she left, though she never mentioned who the caller was. It seemed that someone had arrived to pick Misty up, but the lack of details made it difficult to identify who that might have been. Desperate for answers, detectives requested her phone records, but there was a major setback. At that time, phone companies lacked the ability to provide detailed information about incoming calls, such as the caller's number. All they could confirm was that Misty received 2 calls that evening. The first, a longer conversation, and the second, a brief call right before she left the house. Despite the lack of information from the phone records, investigators hoped that further examination of her personal items would reveal more clues. When they searched Misty's room, they found her purse. But there were 2 notable items missing: her phone and her driver's license. This suggested that Misty hadn't intended to leave for an extended period of time. However, something had gone terribly wrong during her departure. Forensic experts made another striking discovery. The ropes used to bind Misty were the same type commonly found on boats. What was even more telling was the knotting technique. It was a style typically learned in the Navy or the Coast Guard. The duct tape used wasn't just any standard tape. It was a specific kind designed for boat repairs. These details pointed to a troubling possibility. The killer had access to a boat and likely had military training, which made them an even more dangerous suspect. As the investigation progressed, detectives turned their attention to Misty's personal life. Her mother mentioned a man named Teddy, whom Misty had been seeing casually. He was related to one of her co-workers, and while their relationship hadn't gotten very serious, they had gone on a few dates. When detectives looked into Teddy's background, they found something unsettling: a criminal record, including arrests for assault and theft. Despite this, he seemed genuinely upset about Misty's death when questioned, and his behavior didn't suggest he was hiding anything. Still, detectives weren't willing to rule him out just yet, so they requested a DNA sample from him. Teddy complied, offering both the sample and permission to search his apartment without a warrant. But after a thorough investigation, they found nothing linking him to the crime. Additionally, they learned that Teddy had never served in the military and didn't have access to a boat. This led them to question his involvement further, and they began to consider other suspects. Misty's relatives also brought up another man, Bobby, who Misty had gone on a date with. Initially, he didn't seem like a viable suspect, but detectives soon learned that after their date, Misty had told friends that she wasn't interested in seeing him again. This raised suspicions, and Bobby's involvement in the case began to take on a new level of scrutiny. Bobby's calls to Misty continued to grow in frequency and intensity, each one more desperate than the last. He wasn't willing to take no for an answer. The persistence with which he pursued her became almost suffocating. Misty even confided to her friends that Bobby's behavior had begun to feel unsettling, as though he was stalking her. His phone calls were constant, and she expressed growing concern about his relentless pursuit. It wasn't just a passing nuisance, it was becoming a real source of anxiety for her. At this point, she had clearly made it known to Bobby that she wasn't interested, but his calls only intensified. The detectives, sensing that Bobby might hold the key to unraveling the mystery, decided to visit him. When they arrived at his home, they quickly noticed something that would only add to their growing suspicions. There was a boat on Bobby's property. While boats aren't uncommon in certain areas, the fact that Misty's body had been found near a body of water made this detail particularly alarming. The detectives knew that access to boats could be a significant piece of the puzzle, given that Misty had been found in such a location. This discovery alone raised more questions than it answered, but they had to press on. Bobby agreed to answer their questions, and during their conversation, he appeared relatively calm. Perhaps too calm, given the circumstances. He claimed that he wasn't overly bothered by Misty's lack of response, though his actions seemed to contradict his words. Bobby admitted to calling her every day, right up until July 23rd, the day he found out she was dead. His insistence on calling her so frequently was a red flag, yet he acted as if it was completely normal. He even made it seem like her sudden disappearance was no more than an unfortunate turn of events. In what seemed like an odd turn, Bobby suddenly pulled something from his pocket. It was Misty's driver's license. He handed it to the detectives, explaining that he had kept it ever since their first date. According to him, Misty had no pockets that night, so she had asked him to hold on to her ID for safekeeping. She must have forgotten to ask for it back, and so Bobby had kept it ever since. The detectives were immediately suspicious. Their date had taken place weeks ago, and yet Bobby was still holding onto a personal item that would have been easy for him to return. Why hadn't he done so before? The whole story felt rehearsed and forced. The detectives, now even more suspicious of Bobby's involvement, asked for permission to search his home. Bobby consented, but after a thorough search, they found nothing to directly link him to Misty's death. There were no clear connections, no physical evidence that could tie him to the crime scene. To make matters more complicated, Bobby had never served in the military, which meant he didn't fit the profile of the killer that the detectives had been piecing together. The knots found at the scene of the crime, for example, were typically associated with military or maritime training. So, with the absence of any clear connection, the detectives left Bobby's home, still uncertain and with no tangible evidence to go on. But just as they were about to leave, Bobby surprised them once again. He recalled something that might prove useful, a detail from his time with Misty. He mentioned that she had spoken about an ex-boyfriend who had a reputation for being very aggressive. Bobby couldn't recall the man's name, but he did remember one specific detail. The man had served in the Marines. This information instantly captured the detectives' attention, as it fit the profile of the suspect they were investigating. They rushed to speak to Misty's mother to see if she knew who Bobby might have been referring to. Her reaction was immediate. She knew exactly who Bobby was talking about. Misty's mother explained that Misty and her ex, Brent, had been together for quite some time before their relationship ended about a year before her death. She recalled that Misty had described Brent as being controlling and overly possessive. He would constantly demand to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. His behavior grew increasingly troubling, and Misty eventually decided to end the relationship. After their breakup, her mother never heard from Brent again. It seemed as though he had vanished from their lives. But now, this new information suggested that perhaps he had never really gone away. Detectives began to investigate Brent Huck and uncovered some troubling facts. He lived in the same area where Misty's body had been discovered, making him a person of interest. Moreover, he had served in the Marines just as Bobby had described, which matched the profile of the killer. Additionally, Brent worked as a charter boat captain, which meant he had easy access to boats and specialized equipment, further aligning him with the type of person who could be responsible for the crime. Feeling they had enough to warrant questioning him, the detectives brought Brent in for an interview. They didn't confront him directly, but instead presented themselves as merely trying to gather information about Misty's life. They were careful not to tip him off, still unsure whether they had enough to make an arrest. Brent agreed to speak with them. He admitted that after his breakup with Misty, they had kept in touch occasionally, but he insisted that there was nothing romantic between them anymore. The relationship had clearly ended. However, as the interview continued, something felt off. Brent showed little to no emotion when speaking about Misty's death. In fact, his attitude bordered on arrogance, something that stood in stark contrast to the emotional reactions that the detectives had encountered from others involved in the case. This lack of emotion was a key factor that made the detectives suspicious. Brent's nonchalant demeanor contrasted sharply with the reactions of other suspects who had expressed grief and guilt, even if they weren't directly responsible. But Brent's attitude seemed entirely disconnected from the gravity of the situation. Despite his arrogance, detectives managed to glean some important information from him. When asked about the last time he spoke to Misty, Brent named the exact date. Wednesday, July 20th. The same night Misty had told her mother she was heading out to meet someone. Brent admitted that he had called her twice that night, but he claimed they never actually met up. This immediately raised red flags with the detectives. Based on Misty's mother's account, they were now convinced that whoever made the final phone call was likely the person who picked her up. The phone records confirmed this suspicion, showing no other calls received by Misty that evening. Yet Brent stuck to his story, claiming that he had called Misty because he had heard rumors that she was telling people she was pregnant with his child. At the time, he was in a new relationship, and these rumors were causing problems. According to Brent, he called Misty to convince her to stop spreading lies. However, the detectives weren't convinced. Medical examiners had found no signs of pregnancy during Misty's autopsy, and none of her friends had heard her mention anything about being pregnant. Brent's entire story seemed to fall apart under scrutiny. As the detectives' doubts grew, they once again requested permission to search Brent's home. Much like the other suspects, Brent agreed. This time, however, the detectives found something noteworthy. In the kitchen, they discovered multiple plastic bags from a particular store. At first this seemed inconsequential, but the detectives had the bags examined by forensic experts. They soon learned that the bags had all been made on the same production line, at the same factory, and at the same time. The bags in Brent's kitchen had been manufactured in exactly the same way as those found at the crime scene, which meant there was a strong likelihood that the bags used in the crime had come directly from his home. This discovery led to more significant findings. In Brent's garage, the detectives found the same type of rubber cord that had been used in the crime. Upon further inspection, forensic experts confirmed that both the cord found at the scene and the one found in Brent's garage had been produced on the same machine during the same batch. Additionally, they discovered a roll of marine duct tape and rope tied with the same military-style knots found at the crime scene. At this point, the detectives no longer had mere suspicions. They had hard evidence linking Brent to the crime. Despite this, the case hit another hurdle. The prosecutor, after reviewing the case, refused to press charges. He argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, without any direct proof or DNA linking Brent to the crime. There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no concrete physical evidence. All they had were coincidences and circumstantial evidence. As convincing as the case seemed, the prosecutor cautioned that it wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction in court. The case then seemed to stall once again. With no new breakthroughs, the detectives found themselves at an impasse, frustrated by the mounting evidence but unable to move forward. They did, however, have one last piece of evidence. During the investigation, forensic experts had found a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape on Misty's body. After careful analysis, it was determined that the hairs belonged to an animal, likely a dog. Brent just so happened to own a black dog, a mix of German Shepherd and Rottweiler. The detectives suspected that the hairs belonged to his dog, but there was one problem. At the time, no forensic lab in the country had the ability to perform a full DNA analysis on dog hair. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the case continued to remain unresolved. The truth about what happened to Misty was still locked behind a wall of uncertainty, and Brent, though strongly suspected, remained free. The absence of advanced DNA technology at the time had been a significant obstacle. Without the ability to conclusively prove that the hairs found on the duct tape belonged to Brent's dog, the investigators were left with nothing to move forward on. It was a crucial piece of evidence, but without scientific confirmation, it was rendered practically useless in the eyes of the law. The frustration was palpable as the case seemed to stall in place, with no clear way forward. The lack of hard evidence left the detectives in a state of limbo, and Misty's killer remained free. Months passed with no major breakthroughs. The detectives retraced their steps, revisited the evidence, and even re-interviewed witnesses, but every lead seemed to dry up. With no new information or tangible evidence, the case quickly became a cold one. Misty's family, though still hopeful, felt the weight of the stagnation, and the pain of not knowing who had taken their loved one away was unbearable. 2 long years passed with the case still at a standstill, and it seemed like the murder would go unsolved forever. Then, in an unexpected twist, a breakthrough occurred, one that would finally give the detectives the hope they so desperately needed. A recent murder case in California had been solved using a novel approach: DNA analysis of dog hair. The case had caught the attention of forensic experts across the country, and it gave the investigators in Misty's case a new lead to follow. They immediately recognized that this could be the key to unlocking the mystery of Misty's death. The technology that had been unavailable to them just months earlier was now within reach. With renewed determination, the detectives contacted the same forensic lab in California that had helped solve the case and requested their assistance. The timing couldn't have been better. The lab agreed to take a look at the evidence, and forensic specialists began the meticulous process of analyzing the animal hairs found on the duct tape. After weeks of careful examination, they were able to extract a usable DNA profile from the hairs, something that had seemed impossible just a short time ago. The breakthrough felt like a glimmer of hope, and the detectives quickly arranged for a sample to be taken from Brent's dog to compare against the DNA found at the crime scene. When the results finally came back, the truth was undeniable. The DNA from the hairs found on the tape was a perfect match to Brent's dog. But the connection didn't end there. It turned out that the dog wasn't just any dog. It was a gift from Misty herself. During their relationship, Misty had given the dog to Brent, and the animal had become a constant companion of his after their breakup. This revelation not only linked the dog to the crime scene, but also strengthened the connection between Brent and Misty in a way that had never been anticipated. Now armed with irrefutable evidence, the detectives were finally able to take the case to the prosecutor with the confidence they needed to move forward. This time, there would be no hesitation. The prosecutor agreed to file formal charges, and on October 23, 2002, Brent Huck was arrested for the murder of Misty Morse. It had taken over 2 years, but justice was finally within reach. A few months later, Brent's trial began. Throughout the trial, Brent maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had nothing to do with Misty's death, and that the true killer must have been one of her other ex-boyfriends. He tried to shift the blame, claiming that his past relationships had nothing to do with the murder. But the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming, and the prosecution's case was clear and convincing. Each piece of forensic evidence, each witness statement, painted a damning picture of Brent's involvement in Misty's death. The hairs from the duct tape, the boat, the military-style knots, all of it pointed squarely at him. Brent's defense, however, was unwavering. He refused to accept responsibility and continued to deny any involvement in Misty's death. Despite his protests, the jury saw through his claims. After deliberating for several days, they found him guilty of both kidnapping and murder. The weight of the evidence, the disturbing details of his past relationship with Misty, and the critical DNA match were too strong to ignore. Brent Huck was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction was a hard-won victory for Misty's family, and for the detectives who had fought tirelessly to bring her killer to justice. Although the trial was over, there were still many questions that remained unanswered. How exactly did things escalate that night? What happened during that meeting that led to Misty's tragic death? These questions lingered, and the detectives were left to speculate on the details. They believed that something had triggered Brent's violent behavior, possibly fueled by his anger over his breakup with Misty, or perhaps even fear of losing control over his former partner. It was unclear how he managed to convince her to meet up that night, or what ultimately pushed him to such a brutal end. The truth of that night would likely remain a mystery, but the conviction provided some closure to the case, even if it didn't answer every lingering question. After his conviction, Brent attempted to appeal the ruling, hoping to overturn his sentence. But the court rejected his appeal, and the legal process brought him no relief. As of today, he remains incarcerated, still maintaining his innocence, despite the mounting evidence against him. His continued insistence that he had nothing to do with Misty's murder only adds to the growing sense of disbelief that he could commit such a heinous crime and still deny his guilt. The case of Misty Morse's murder is one that left a profound impact on everyone involved. From the moment her body was discovered, to the painstaking efforts of the detectives, to the eventual conviction of Brent Huck, it was a long and difficult journey. It serves as a reminder that sometimes justice takes time, but with persistence and the right tools, the truth will eventually come to light. Misty's family and friends finally had some peace, knowing that the man responsible for her death would never see freedom again.